Russia is known as the land of billionaires, yet the average worth of any given Russian citizen is only $18,000. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the economic culture of Russia, and I'm going to do this by breaking it down into three major segments. First, the general structure of the economy. Second, the inherent status of the economy. And finally, pros and cons of the Russian economy. First, let's talk about the general structure. According to the CIA World Factbook, Russia has what is known as a mixed economy. This means it is broken up 50-50 between the public and private sector. The private sector in Russia controls most of the energy exports that come out of Russia, while the public sector controls most of the domestic production. This has a couple of advantages and disadvantages. In the United States, most everything is controlled by the private sector, which offers more advantages to the public. But in Russia, because it's broken up 50-50, the economy is a little bit more stable, a little bit easier to be controlled, but is not as advantageous to the general population. Now, let's talk about the primary production of Russia. What do they actually produce? How do they make revenue? As probably many of you are familiar with, Russia is the #1 producer of oil in the world. Oil is, of course, extremely useful for fueling our cars, but it's also critical for producing many products that you and I use every single day. They're also the #1 producer of natural gas and coal. Natural gas is used by a lot of first world nations to produce all of their electricity. It's a little bit more expensive, but it burns cleaner than coal, so that's why first world nations typically buy a lot of Russian natural gas. Coal, on the other hand, is still the #1 fuel source used to produce electricity worldwide, and all three of these combined represent the vast majority of Russia's yearly revenues. Unfortunately, as the world moves away from these non-renewable resources towards more environmentally friendly renewable resources, Russia's revenues in this sector, their primary economic sector, is beginning to decline, which is of course not advantageous for Russia at all. Another important sector of the Russian economy is mining. The three things that Russia generally mines are gold, industrial diamonds, and rare earth elements. Gold is valuable by itself, but it's especially valuable today because of electronics. Many of us in this room have iPhones or Galaxies, and gold is a very critical component of all of these devices. It's extremely valuable, and Russia is using this export very effectively to generate revenue. Rare earth elements and diamonds are also very valuable when producing electronics, but unfortunately for Russia, nations like China or many South American countries are beginning to increase their exports of these resources, which are driving Russia's revenues down, continually hurting their economy. Finally, Russia's defense industry. As many of you are probably familiar with, Russia is a very militaristic society. They have the second strongest military in the world, second only, of course, to ourselves. The Russians, actually, 20% of all manufacturing that they do per year is in this sector. They produce thousands upon thousands of guns, tanks, planes, and boats. Last year, their revenue from this industry was $13 billion. And this is very unfortunate because Russians are selling a lot of their weapons to nations that the United States, along with other world organizations such as the United Nations, don't exactly agree with, such as Syria. And so recently the United Nations and the United States have put a lot of economic sanctions on Russia, punishing them for their trade arrangements. Finally, in this section, they're primarily export-based, which is a disadvantage for their economy. 90% of all production within Russia is exported in the form of trade to other nations. While trade is a great way for a nation to earn revenue, because this trade is primarily focused in one or two sectors, it makes their economy very weak and possibly very fragile. Next, moving on to the inherent status of the Russian economy. According to The Economist, there's a massive wealth gap in Russia. While there are thousands and thousands of billionaires within Russia itself, the average Russian is actually very poor, and this is very damaging for the economy. They are ranked number 77 with regards to this wealth gap disparity, and this is not a good thing at all for an economy. Next, their growth is slowing. According to the National Interest, Russia has the 7th highest GDP in the world at $2.5 trillion, and in the past 5 years, that GDP has grown only 3.5%. And economists project over the next 5 years, that growth is going to slow down, it might even stop, and it may begin to decline, which is, of course, extremely disadvantageous for Russia. The next problem that they face is no innovation. While nations like the United States or other first world countries are pumping billions, if not trillions of dollars per year into sectors like high tech, Russia is putting no money into these kind of areas. They're putting all the money that they generate from their use of oil and natural gas back into this industry, just trying to squeeze every dollar that they can out of it. Fourth, Russia is known as a fading star economy. As stated by the Heritage Foundation, their GDP is slowing down and decreasing. Exports of oil, natural gas, and coal are decreasing. Their military exports are leading to very strict economic punishments from other nations. And finally, the wealth gap and unemployment are rising dramatically in Russia. Last but not least, I want to talk about some basic pros and cons of the Russian economy. So one advantage is the Russian economy is less reactive to downturns than the American economy. Back in 2008, during the credit crunch, when stock markets globally took a major hit, the Russian economy didn't decrease as quickly, according to the Wall Street Journal, because of very strict government oversight. This can be a disadvantage, on the other hand, because when times are good, their economy doesn't grow as quickly. Next, they have a very strong economic base. While it is pretty old-fashioned, seeing as most of the revenue comes from oil, these natural resources are valuable and have been a good source of revenue for Russia for many decades. Some cons, their economy is very limited. Most of the money comes from these natural resources, which makes their economy very fragile and easily damaged. And finally, there's no future investment. Russia's pumping all of their money into resources that they already have and that are quickly diminishing, and this can be very damaging. So while the Russian economy does offer some interesting advantages, we must see that our American economy is by far superior to that of Russian economic culture. Thank you very much, and God bless America.